Yep.
So yeah, I mean, what's very fascinating with Christianity, obviously, is the discovery in 1945, the Nag Hammadi Gnostic Gospels, which I think were found in a cave in Saudi Arabia, and kind of totally changed and complexified the image of what was going on in those the centuries when Christ was alive and after, and particularly with the Gospel of Thomas and a number of the other Gospels. It really suggests there was a huge amount of like creative, sort of esoteric ferment, and people thinking about the meaning of Christ's kind of incarnation in different ways. And originally it was much more, seems that it was much more a effort at kind of self-initiation. The idea that the individual was meant to undergo this process of realization rather than what it became, which is like have faith. You're saved by having faith in the divinity of Christ. Instead, it was like Christ is showing you the path to reach that divinity um, within a lifetime. So in the Gospel of Thomas, he says many interesting things. I mean, some of it sounds very much like the Emerald Tablet. When you make the two one, and when you make the inside like the outside, and the outside like the inside, and the above like below, and you make the male and the female one and the same, so the male not being male, but the female female. When you fashion eyes in the place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, and a likeness in place of a likeness, then you will enter the kingdom. Or at another point, he just says, open the door for yourself so you will know what is. So yeah, I mean, it gives you a much more complex idea of what was happening, and that actually the history of the church is really about winnowing down this extremely, complex, very Gnostic kind of set of ideas to something much more simplistic that could more easily be codified and kind of used as a tool for indoctrination. Um, Another interesting early text was the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which actually I think was not part of the Nag Hammadi Gospels, but it only has a few chapters that were existing. But it was clear that Mary Magdalene was kind of like Jesus's or Christ's top disciple. She was really the one that had an understanding of what he was doing, and that's why he kind of loved her the most, which clearly pissed off all of the other disciples. And it was also clear that for him there was no real distinction between man and woman, no hierarchy in that sense. And this is just a quote, one of those few existing chapters. The other disciples were exhorting Mary to help them out and tell them what she knows. She's like, tell us the words of the Savior, which you remember, which you know, but we do not, nor have we heard them. Mary answered and said, what is hidden from you, I will proclaim to you. And she began to speak to them these words. She said, I saw the Lord in a vision, and I said to him, Lord, I saw you today in a vision. He answered and said to me, blessed are you that you do not waver at the sight of me. Where the mind is, the mind, I guess, is once again the nous that they talked about, Neoplatonism. Where the mind is, there is the treasure. And so I guess the implication, as commentators on this gospel say, is that, what was too much for the other disciples, like seeing his resurrection body or whatever, she could actually handle. And also, apparently, the fact that he was going to go through this crucifixion, she realized that didn't mean anything as he did, whereas all the other ones were like, no, don't leave us. How dare you, how can you leave us? And so on. So she was actually more on his level than any of the other disciples. So Gnosticism tends to be thought of as a dualistic religion, or kind of offshoot or heretical offshoot of early Christianity. But it seems that it's more closely accurate to say that it was kind of the inheritance of those sort of pagan mystery schools, Eleusis, and other ones that kind of also included Neoplatonism, sacred geometry, some of the Gnostic ideas are that humans are sparks of the divine light, became imprisoned in the world of matter, and must escape from it to find their way back to their divine source. And there's a way of doing this by attaining Gnosis, knowledge of their divine origin. Gnostics can escape the false world of ignorance. Also in Gnosticism, there's a big focus on the goddess Sophia, who was a goddess in the Pleroma, who had a vision of this dream of this beautiful planet called the Earth, and sort of became more and more enraptured by her dream, and sort of fell into the material universe to become the Earth. And in that fall from the Pleroma, from this sort of super substantive state, she caused all these ripples and wrinkles in the space-time firmament, and out of those little ruptures emerged these kind of deviant, evil beings called the Archons, who were led by a being called the Demiurge. Now we saw in Plato, he was talking about the Demiurge as the good kind of ruler of the universe who was creating like order and harmony. For the Gnostics, the Demiurge is actually the leader of a group of deviant sort of spirits who have actually constructed the material world as a prison, as like a delusional reality, and stuck us, sort of keep us trapped in there and try to keep us from finding our way back to the sort of divine realms. So, for instance, the Gnostics in some of their texts reinterpret the Garden of Eden myth in such a way that the snake in the Garden of Eden that gives the apple is actually Christ, who comes in that disguised form to help the deluded humans who've been trapped in this kind of false reality by giving them the way back to knowledge. So yeah, it's a kind of flip over. Sophia, very beautiful book on this whole Gnostic thing is Not in His Image by John Lamb Lash. And I think this quote is from that book. Enthralled by the possibilities of the human singularity and the anthropos, Sophia drifts away from the Pleroma. The Pleroma is like this sort of place in the center of the Milky Way where all the gods kind of live in this sort of immaterial state of perfection. She departs from the cosmic center and plunges into the realm of external swirling chaos outside the galactic core. So in the Gnostic myth, not only are humans meant to find the sparks of divine knowledge, to awaken themselves, but also to help awaken Sophia from her dream so that the earth becomes her dream again. Obviously, it's, we know that this was a very inspirational kind of mythology for a lot of science fiction, particularly like The Matrix is a very Gnostic-like idea, people being imprisoned in this false Matrix-like reality, ruled over by these beings who are, extremely powerful and kind of just using humans as energy batteries in a way. The Demiurge of the Old Testament, according to John Lamb Lash, is an arrogant, demented pretender who claims that humans are made in his image. Made in his image signifies the total enslavement of humanity to an alien off-planet agenda. Nothing serves the hidden controllers for cover better than a message of cosmic love. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek, forgive the perpetrator. This all fosters the victim-perpetrator bond. So Lash's idea is that the Bible, as it finally was kind of codified, was actually a trick of the Archons, who mingled together, wisdom and so on, but they also identified these kind of core flaws in the human psychology through which they could enslave us and imprison us. And so, for instance, the Christ message in the Bible about turning the other cheek, forgive those who hate you, love thy enemies, and so on. That for Lash was all of a trick to keep us in this state of enslavement. There's another thing I was going to say about that. Yeah. So then what happened? How did early Christianity go from being another interesting facet is the possibility that there was a mushroom cult in early Christianity. John Allegro, who was a major art historian at Princeton, wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And he found evidence of a mushroom cult in early Christianity. He actually argued in that book that there might not have been an actual physical person who was a Christ, but actually when they talked about the pronouncements of Christ, that was actually what the mushroom was telling them in their trances. And Allegro was resoundingly kind of ridiculed, and in a way his work was suppressed after that. It's still a fascinating book. I don't know if I would take it as far as he does, but there's a lot of good evidence of there being at least some use of mushrooms in early Christianity and frescoes and so on, and perhaps even the sacrament, the blood and the blood and the body of Christ, very likely could be a kind of substitution for a psychoactive or psychedelic sacrament. So how did this shift happen? I mean, it happened over several hundred years, and there were sort of the early church fathers. There was Paul. There was Irenaeus, who wrote a refutation of Gnosticism, and they began to insist on faith being more important than direct mystical experience. Irenaeus wrote about the Gnostics. Error, indeed, is never set forth in its naked deformity, lest being thus exposed, it should be once be detected. But it is craftily decked out in an attractive dress, so as by its outward form to make it appear to the inexperienced more true than truth itself. So more and more through Irenaeus, through Paul, through Irenaeus, then up through Augustine, the church codified itself around faith rather than direct experience, hierarchy, kind of ultimately the sort of doctrine of the church. The Bible, for many centuries was only available to the priests who spoke Latin. And it was only with the Reformation that the common people could access the Word of God for themselves. So the Nag Hammadi library just seems like one of those very numinous correspondences in esoteric history, that these things were discovered in 1945 in Egypt, in a cave. And we had the Gospel of Thomas, these sayings attributed to Jesus, the Gospel of Philip, all emphasizing the direct experience of the divine, the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the other disciples. The Gospel of Truth emphasizes the importance of self-knowledge and spiritual awakening as the means to achieve salvation. The Apocryphon of John, an alternative version of the creation story, describing the fall of the divine being Sophia and the creation of the material world by the Demiurge, a lesser deity. Of course, on the negative side, this sort of Gnostic focus on the material world as like a fallen reality could lead to a kind of hatred of the physical or disregard of the physical, which obviously also became a theme in Christianity. Another important text from that library is called the Hypostasis of the Archons. This was a cosmological myth explaining the origins of the world and humanity. According to this text, the Archons, these sort of lesser or deviant spiritual beings, create the material world and attempt to enslave humanity. And we need Gnosis, we need to access this sort of divine nous in order to overcome the Archons and attain liberation. This is a quote from the Hypostasis of the Archons. A veil exists between the world above and the realms that are below, and shadow came into being beneath the veil. And that shadow became matter, and that shadow was projected apart. And what she had created became a product in the matter, like an aborted fetus. And it assumed a plastic form molded out of shadow, and became an arrogant beast resembling a lion. Another major current in those early centuries in the classical world was Neoplatonism, 3rd century AD. sort of developed by a whole group of philosophers and thinkers, including Plotinus, Porphyry, Iamblichus, and then, of course, Hypatia. Neoplatonism has a doctrine of monism, that all reality can be derived from a single principle, the one or the all. And from the one emanates the divine mind, the nous, and in turn from the divine mind emanates the world soul, the psyche. And there may have been an influence of Indian philosophy, Samkhya, on the development of Neoplatonism. And this is, for me, an area where I'm really excited about learning more in the future and reading more of these texts from Plotinus and Iamblichus. I find it really beautiful and resonant. And Neoplatonism, as we will see, had a huge ongoing influence in Europe in the early Renaissance up through the 17th century. Theurgy, a set of unknown practices, we don't really know what they were exactly, through which God, Creator, was believed to manifest himself directly, uniting with theurgic practitioners. Like many other manifestations of the search for Gnosis in late antiquity, notably Hermetism, theurgical union seems to have required the induction of unusual, ecstatic, or trance-like states of consciousness through which the divine realities were believed to be experienced directly. According to Iamblichus, after the theurgic discipline has conjoined the soul individually with the several departments of the universe and with all the divine powers that pervade it, then it leads the soul to the creator of the world, places it in his charge, and frees it of everything pertaining to the realm of matter, uniting it with the sole eternal reason, logos. So, so theurgy, I guess, was sort of a set of practices where you would sort of rise up to the level of divinity, of God or a God, have that consciousness kind of speak through you or work through you, and that would be a path to Gnosis.
Do we know how many people had this experience?
Nope.
Oh.
Let me get some here. So Hypatia, Greek philosopher and mathematician. She was head of the Platonist school in Alexandria, Egypt, and she was assassinated very violently in 415 AD. I think it was a group of Christian monks stripped her naked and stoned her to death or something. This marked the end of paganism and the triumph of Christianity, the final act of a 100-year-old feud waged by the new religion against the ancient world. Then you have Augustine, St. Augustine, who started as a Neoplatonist and Manichaean. He converted to Christianity in 31. He's probably a good idea because I think Manichaeanism had actually been outlawed under pain of punishment of death. So it's probably a good idea to scab out of Manichaeanism and move into Christianity. I think he was Algerian, North African, which is sort of interesting. And he developed a huge, incredibly influential corpus of work that shaped the development of Christianity and the church, that prioritized faith over direct mystical experience, even though he himself had some direct mystical experiences which transformed him and led him to the Christian path, apparently. Augustine also was very much focused on the doctrine of original sin, the idea that all humans inherit Adam's sin, which requires the necessity of divine grace to achieve salvation. He also had an idea of predestination, that God predestines certain individuals to be saved, emphasizing the sovereignty of God in salvation. And that also is a very tricky idea when we think about Christianity today and the sort of evangelicals who kind of believe that if you're among the saved, it doesn't matter whether you vote for Donald Trump or whatever, you're already in that community. Augustine was also an early theorist of just war, the idea that there were criteria in which Christians could engage in warfare. And he took various aspects of Neoplatonism and brought them into Christianity, including this idea of a hierarchy of being. He adopted the Neoplatonist concept of a hierarchy of existence with God at the top, followed by spiritual beings, including hierarchies of angels, and then material beings. And Augustine believed that human knowledge comes from divine illumination, the illumination of the human mind by God, a concept that was influenced by Neoplatonism's emphasis on the role of divine intellect in understanding reality. So yeah, so there was this very kind of dramatic shift over several hundred years from those early centuries of sort of questioning and self-initiation, perhaps use of psychedelic sacraments like mushrooms, to this very faith-based, very hierarchical system that then ruled the Anglo-European world for many centuries. Alchemy, and oops, as we discussed a little bit, alchemy is grounded in laboratory procedures pertaining to the domain of science or natural philosophy. From the perspective of the study of Western esotericism, alchemy is best understood as a complex historical and cultural phenomenon that cannot be contained within any single discipline, but is characterized by basic procedures of transmutation that may be pursued as science in laboratory settings and function as narratives in religious, philosophical, or even psychological discourse. So it was kind of, in its own way, kind of protean, kind of changeable, mercurial in a sense, and somehow this quest for, very kind of physical substance of this philosopher's stone, these elixirs and so on, was also recognized as a spiritual effort towards purification. For medieval alchemists, they made an association between the alchemical process and Christ. Christ could be described metaphorically as the philosopher's stone, through whose action human beings were transmuted from gross materiality into spiritual gold. And yeah, we find alchemy like all over the place. There's Egyptian alchemists, as Franklin mentioned. They were skilled metallurgists and artisans, and skilled in metalworking, glassmaking, creating pigments and dyes, and also had a strong interest in the mystical aspects of the craft. Greek alchemy, heavily influenced by Egyptian alchemy. There were early Greek alchemists such as Zosimos of Panopolis and Maria the Jewess, contributed to the development of alchemical theory and practice, including the concept of four elements and the idea of transmutation. There's Chinese alchemy, kind of Taoist alchemy, that also sought an elixir of life and the attainment of immortality. Indian alchemy, with interest in metallurgy and medicine, herbalism, linked to the Ayurvedic tradition. Indian alchemy, known as Rasa Shastra, sought to discover the secret immortality, the transmutation of metals, the use of various chemical processes, and the preparation of medicinal elixirs. So it's kind of, I mean, from a Jungian sense, you would say that this is, for 1,500, 2,000 years, like a very powerful archetype in the collective psyche of humanity across many cultures. Almost looking maybe in a way towards modern chemistry and modern science and whatever we've been creating since. Then you have medieval and Renaissance alchemists in the Anglo-European world. Roger Bacon, the 13th century, one of the first to advocate for the experimental method and study of natural phenomena. So that was another thing. Alchemy was this kind of bridge between kind of just this allegorical or analogical consciousness to moving towards the experimental method in science and more kind of objective evaluation of physical evidence. Bacon discovered gunpowder, apparently, and did work in optics. Albertus Magnus in the 13th century, a Dominican friar, explored the practical applications of alchemy in metallurgy and mineralogy. Raymond Lull, a Catalan philosopher, theologian, and writer, a prominent figure in the development of European alchemy. His works combined Christian, Neoplatonic, and Islamic ideas, and he devised an elaborate symbolic system for representing the relationships between various alchemical elements and principles. I'll skip Flamel as he ended up being sort of dubious. He was thought to have created the Philosopher's Stone, then later on this turned out to be a concoction of later authors. Then you have obviously the alchemical principles, calcination, solution, separation, conjunction, uh, dissolving the substance, heating the substance, dissolving it, separating it, recombining it, fermentation, uh, distillation, coagulation, and certain obviously compounds were particularly important to the alchemists, like mercury, probably above all, and saltpeter. And yes, the final achievement of alchemy is a purified substance that, on the one hand, represents this mastery of the physical, but also somehow a spiritual ascension or an integration of the self. As we'll see later, there are some thinkers or more modern thinkers, like the traditionalist Julius Evola, who believes that all of the alchemical symbols were actually a metaphor for attaining continuity of consciousness between sleep and dream. In his book, The Hermetic Tradition, he talks about that. And then you have this, very interesting, never-ending quest for the Philosopher's Stone, which apparently was first mentioned in around 300 BC by Zosimus of Panopolis. A reddish tincture or powder that can turn base metals into gold, but also it's the elixir of life, brings about immortality, rejuvenation. Alchemists say the stone can be found everywhere, but goes unrecognized. And then obviously there's all the psychological and psychospiritual interpretations, as Paul Critsis notes. The alembic or vessel is the human body, and the philosopher's stone is consciousness purified of its physical drives and carnal desires through a repeated cycle of conjunctions or chemical marriages, if you like, between the masculine and feminine powers, Sol and Luna, sun and moon. Another stream of Hermeticism is Jewish Hermeticism. We talked about the Sefer Yetzirah a little bit earlier. A very fascinating text, very important for Jewish Kabbalah, is Zohar, which is attributed to a 2nd century Jewish sage, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but apparently was almost definitely written by a 13th century Spanish Jewish mystic, Moses de Leon. There's an interesting tendency of this sort of pseudo-epigraphical texts where in the Hermetic tradition, where somebody like offers a text that seems to be from some person in the past. I think Moses de Leon even wrote his own kind of commentary on the Zohar, as if he was writing a commentary on this, amazing book from the 2nd century that he had discovered, where actually he had written it himself. So that's kind of, I don't think you could exactly call it forgery or plagiarism. It was almost like they were entering into this other state of consciousness, like the self maybe wasn't quite as like fixed an idea as we have now. And the Zohar, is definitely very fascinating. I haven't read too much of it, but I was, checking out a bit. And I found this incredible passage around the beard and the beard hairs of God, macro proposis or something. And it describes like his, the meaning of all the beard and the hairs as they flow down his chin. And, it's like you can really feel that actually, the writing of these texts, then the reading of them is in itself a way to reach like other states of consciousness, like trance-like states of consciousness. I think I put up the reference to the beard stuff in the group somewhere, but it's definitely fun reading. Maybe we'll read a little bit out loud at some point. So the themes of the Zohar include God's nature, the divine as both transcendent and immanent in the world, the emanation of the divine energy from the infinite light or the Ein Sof into the Sephiroth. We have these 10 attributes of God that are familiar from the Tree of Life. They're kind of the circles, 10 circles in the Tree of Life. And then represent kind of this energy flowing in from the Ein Sof on the top, this sort of unknown divine emanation into, increasingly substantial and physicalized forms, with Malkuth, the earth plane, being the bottom Sephiroth, so stuck on the bottom. But actually, this way that we now look at it as this kind of linear kind of descent kind of symbol. There's only one way to look at it. This other symbol on the lower left is another way that traditionally they were drawing the Sephirot, where you can get a sense that it's all kind of like just nested together without that sort of time space linearity. So essentially, then you had the early Renaissance. Basically, after the kind of the fall of Rome and the Dark Ages, all of this sort of esoteric knowledge, all the sort of important classical Neoplatonic texts and so on, ended up in Alexandria and other sort of Near Eastern libraries. And it was only, I think, in the 10th or 11th century when Constantinople was sacked, the Arab world was sort of defeated. Then these scholars began to sort of trickle back into Italy and Spain with these texts from the classical world. And Cosimo de' Medici, who was fascinated by this knowledge, would hire spies to go and find them and buy the books. Then he brought them back to Florence for Marsilio Ficino to translate. And Ficino translated all of Plato's works, but then they found a copy of the Corpus Hermeticum. He was immediately reassigned to, as quickly as possible, translate Corpus Hermeticum from an incomplete manuscript that contained its first 14 treatises. And the Corpus Hermeticum was resoundingly believed to be texts that were written by Hermes Thoth way back when, in the time of Moses, when this incredible magus being of Hermes Thoth existed. Although now it seems more likely that they were written in the 1st century AD. Ficino was one of the major proponents of the sort of Neoplatonic Christian Kabbalistic humanist Renaissance, and kind of even more thought about now than Ficino is Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who was a super fascinating character, who was like an incredible prodigy from a aristocratic family, so he's quite wealthy, and traveled all over Italy with his team of like scholars and advisors and tutors and his intellectual friends. And when he was 23, he wrote this collection of theses, 900 theses, that he believed were going to change the world forever, and were going to unleash like a new age of knowledge and illumination, and that they were also going to end the sort of sectarianism between religions. As for him, it was so convincing because he studied, he learned all these languages, he learned Hebrew, he read Kabbalistic texts. He became convinced that his understanding that he would convey would be so powerful that it would show how the Hebrew and the Christian doctrines were really the same, that all of the Jews would immediately convert. So you would have no more problem, in terms of Jews and Christians. Unfortunately, so Ficino, when he was Mirandola, when he was 23 and he wrote the 900 Theses, he wanted to have a huge debate at the Vatican where he was going to bring all of the major intellectuals and philosophers and scholars from across Europe, and they would debate the 900 Theses, and that would lead to this new age of illumination and humanism and so on. But unfortunately, the church didn't agree with what he was doing, and they declared 13 of his theses to be heretical, particularly the ones having to do with the sort of Jewish knowledge. Mirandola claimed the fundamental truths of Christianity were found in pagan mysteries, but also in the secret tradition of Kabbalah that God revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai, and that was just too much for the church. So instead, Mirandola sort of had to get out on a hurry and take off on a run, and that was kind of he never really got a chance to debate his work publicly. And he also wrote the famous Oration of the Dignity of Man, which I put in the texts and sources, which is very beautiful to read, which really is still considered like a foundational text of the early Renaissance vision of the world and of humanity. And in that book, Mirandola wrote, "Man's place in the universe is somewhere between the beasts and the angels, but because of the divine image planted in him, there are no limits to what man can accomplish." So it's really this very beautiful vision of sort of infinite horizon and utopian possibility, for the human being. Um, and yes, I know down the bottom, Mirandola was really the originator of the Christian Kabbalah, and he popularized number symbolism, which became an essential part of the modern Western Hermetic tradition. Um, Not my forte, although I'm always willing to learn more. And he died at the age of 31. The theory is that he was poisoned, perhaps by one of the somebody from the church. They recently exhumed his and his friends' bodies and found that they were laced with arsenic. So it seems highly likely that he was poisoned. Uh, and then another sort of super fascinating character to come to grips with is Cornelius Agrippa in the early 16th century, who wrote a number of books, very kind of like uh, paradigm-breaking minds. I mean, he wrote one book kind of like mocking all the different knowledge systems, including occult knowledge. He also wrote a pamphlet arguing that women were superior to men. So he was an early feminist. But then he spent a lot of time putting together these three books of occult philosophy um, that became kind of the foundational text on Renaissance magic, blending Neoplatonism, Kabbalah, and Hermeticism. And he was many things. A lot of these guys led these kind of amazing lives of kind of like traveling to these different European courts and trying to like get different aristocrats and patrons on their side and so on. But Agrippa was a philosopher, theologian. I mean, he was definitely a very pious or believing Christian with this sort of Neoplatonic Kabbalistic slant. Um, and he actually has been often later on was associated with black magic and was the model for one of the main models for Faust, Goethe's Faust. And in the three books of occult philosophy, Agrippa writes, "Magic is a faculty of wonderful virtue, full of most high mysteries, containing the most profound contemplation of most secret things, together with the nature, power, quality, substance, and virtues thereof, as also the knowledge of whole nature, and it doth instruct us concerning the differing and agreement of things amongst themselves, whence it produceth its wonderful effects, by uniting the virtues of things through the application of them one to the other." A lot of the, certainly in the first book, a lot of it is focused on kind of showing that the human mind, our will and intention can influence the physical world in a variety of ways. And he looks at how this happens in healing or in changes to the weather, and basically then he argues that this is based on our relationship to these different layers, the sort of natural layer, the astral layer, and the super celestial, the divine layer. And the magus is the one who learns how to intentionally make use of these connections, these different realms, in order to affect transformation. In the three books of occult philosophy, Agrippa defines the three worlds or domains of reality according to the prevailing Aristotelian and Ptolemaic system. He describes the cosmos as a gigantic sphere with our world at the center, with the moon and the other planets circling around it and the stars fixed on the interior surface of the sphere. I mean, obviously, as we move forward, the shift to a heliocentric model is a big deal for both magic and science. So he was still having this traditional vision of it. Book one explores the natural and sublunar world, consisting of the four elements. Book two is about the abstract realities pertaining to the middle realm of the planetary spheres, between the moon and the fixed stars. And book three discusses the angelic and divine realities outside the cosmic globe, Christian Kabbalah. A major theme of the book is the power of language in magic, which for Agrippa is more than just a tool of communication. It creates a metaphysical bridge between different levels of reality, and these can be manipulated by the will, intention, and even the breath of the magician. According to Agrippa's philosophy of mind, the human being bridges these three registers of reality: the terrestrial, celestial, and the supercelestial. And this gives the capacity to manipulate the earth, the terrestrial world, through language and other magical practices. So yeah, big focus is the power of language in bringing about magic. Also the influences of the planetary spheres and the natural elements and all those things, and how the logos is directly connected to the higher realms of reality. So even knowing the name of something, like knowing the name of a spirit, gives you a potentially power over it, makes a direct ontological connection between the sign and the signifier. And in these books, I think it's the last book, Agrippa also looks at angelic languages. This is one of those angelic scripts called Malachim. And he was also very interested in Hebrew, which he believed was closer to or was perhaps the original language that God may have used to kind of bring the world into being. So it was the most powerful language to use for magical work. Paracelsus. Yeah, I mean, he was kind of on the sort of medical side of the alchemical tradition, arguing, he was sort of a bridge between the sort of old theories of Galen and kind of a more experimental approach. He thought that physicians should learn directly from nature by means of experiment. He introduced a whole new medical terminology, talking about the four elements, but also mercury, sulfur, and salt. Kind of in the sort of evolution of Renaissance magic, one of the crucial figures is John Dee, who is such a wonderful character to explore. Very fascinating in that he was right on the sort of border, somewhere between imperial power and magic and lunacy, and science. So he was a skilled mathematician, astronomer, astrologer. He sort of, in a sort of underground fashion, was a supporter of Copernicus and heliocentrism. Copernicus himself actually believed that the shift from the Earth-centered cosmos to a sun-centered cosmos was very much a shift that would support his own Neoplatonism, which talked about kind of like the divine spark within and so on. John Dee was a scientific advisor and court magician for Queen Elizabeth I, and he actually strongly advised Elizabeth to send Francis Drake to the New World. At that point, Spain was already colonizing the New World. England was quite far behind. And John Dee said that, basically England had to go and contest with Spain for the New World. And as Benjamin Woolley writes in The Queen's Conjurer, Drake was in the midst of preparations for his voyage around the world, and catching the mood of adventure sweeping through court, Dee laid before the Queen an astounding proposal. England, he said, should challenge Spain's imperial claim to the New World, which actually Dee called the New Atlantis. And then, Dee wrote a long series of extremely difficult and abstruse kind of magical texts. But he was probably most, well remembered as channeling this angelic language, the Enochians and these spirits, with a kind of itinerant kind of scryer, medium, and forger named Edward Kelly. Yeah, this is just a quote about John Dee. The magic of a bold operator like Dee aims beyond the stars, aims at doing the super celestial mathematical magic, the angel conjuring magic. This is a picture of him, an etching of him with Edward Kelly, his partner in the crime. Dee firmly believed that he had gained contact with good angels from whom he learned advancement in knowledge. The sense of close contact with angels or spiritual beings is the hallmark of the Rosicrucian. And as we'll see, John Dee was a big inspiration for the Rosicrucian movement, which started soon after his death. There's also a theory that I can't remember where I encountered it, that actually since Dee was right at the beginning of the English colonialization process and also the first corporation, the East India Corporation, that he actually maybe got in touch with like the wrong group of spiritual beings. Like they were actually more like archons that were kind of devious and sort of led him and the whole society kind of like astray into confusion. Interesting idea to consider. This was one of Dee's many magical tracts, just as an example of how his thinking worked. The hieroglyphic monad. And the hieroglyphic monad is this little geometrical symbol in the middle of that image of the little sort of like Mercury being with the horns, the circle and the lines beneath it. So the hieroglyphic monad was a treatise of the nature of the universe and the relationships between different aspects of reality. A complex symbolic system based on a hieroglyph or emblem that Dee created. This emblem is composed of various geometric shapes and symbols. Dee claimed that it represented the unity of all things in the universe. And he believed that this emblem could be used to reveal the hidden connections between different aspects of reality, such as the planets, the elements, and the human body. And it was used by other alchemists, such as Michael Meyer. Very abstruse book, very, very sort of complex, but it shows that there was this kind of fervent sense that the sort of the philosopher's stone, the elixir of mortality, the nature of reality was like close at hand. It was just like a step away, like an imaginal projection away if you can reach it. This is a little bit of the Enochian script, the angelic language. And as I mentioned, Edward Kelly was a medium and a scryer. They used crystal balls and other tools to establish communication with angels. And the language was revealed after a series of different spiritual encounters, mediumships, named after the biblical figure Enoch. And it's a unique alphabet with its own grammar and syntax. There are some people who make the very bold claim that it was such an alien grammar, language, and syntax that it really, suggests that they were, that it was truthful, that this really was this sort of other beings from another realm. Then others have analyzed it and say that actually it's quite similar to English in its syntax, and there isn't really, it could just as easily have been kind of made up, concocted by Edward Kelly. The angels instructed Dee and Kelly to build this table to communicate with them, which they used to kind of like a Ouija board, I guess, to point to the different letters and symbols and create words and proclamations in this language. Edward Kelly himself was kind of a rascal. And as Benjamin Woolley writes in The Queen's Conjurer, Kelly was a fugitive, accused of forgery, fractious, irascible, and unreliable. But none of this seemed to dent John Dee's trust in the man's scrying ability. The flaws in his nature were evidence of his strengths as a scryer. An effective medium needs to be like a child or even an animal, instinctive, volatile, highly sensitive to his surroundings, and unconstrained by intellect or experience. Where it counted, Kelly delivered. The richness and sophistication of his visions, the combination of clear divine light and complex Kabbalistic formulas, was not only captivating, but convincing. So I find that very interesting, even up into the present day, where a lot of people who have sort of mediumship skills or kind of an interest in the occult or follow magical practices often seem to have this sort of imbalanced quality to them, or zany, kind of like off kilter, like they're sort of out, they're off kilter from the normal world. And that it's interesting that Dee was kind of aware enough of the need of that he saw that as a feature or something positive in Kelly's makeup rather than something that made him want to dismiss Kelly. Although the ultimate value of this whole Enochian system is definitely one that can be debated if anything really came out of it. This is an example of the kind of proclamations that the angels made. I think at one point the angels also instructed, and remember these were all coming from Edward Kelly, who was getting the messages, instructed Kelly indeed to swap their wives for a night or two. They also said, "The corners and straits of the earth shall be measured to the depth, and strange shall be the wonders that are creeping into new worlds. Time shall be altered with the difference in day and night. All things have grown almost to their fullness." So that's the kind of proclamation that these angels were making. So yeah, inspired by kind of John Dee and the Christian Kabbalistic Renaissance in the early 17th century, you have this kind of Rosicrucian moment or movement, and a fantastic book about it, although some of her ideas are now challenged, is Francis Yates's book, The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. So essentially around 1615, these three manifestos came out in quick succession, and they became kind of like cause celebs in Europe. The manifestos would appear to be proclamations of enlightenment in the form of a utopian myth about a world in which enlightened beings, almost assimilated to spirits, go about doing good, shedding healing influences, disseminating knowledge in the natural sciences and the arts, and bringing mankind back to its paradisal state before the fall. And Yates talks about this movement in relationship to different like political, social things that were happening in that period. There was, I guess, Rudolph II, and there was a younger prince and princess who were kind of like very interested in alchemy and magic in Bohemia for a few years. And suddenly there was this kind of flourishing of esoteric thought. And once again, sort of like we saw back in the 4th century, then in the 13th, the 14th century or 15th century with Mirandola, this kind of effort to kind of add on to Christianity another layer of kind of initiatory knowledge, self-realization, which then the church and the sort of establishment recognize as a threat, and then they seek to stop it, or they step it out. That's kind of what happened here. So there was this Rosicrucian moment for a few years, then kind of outrage against it, and then the whole thing went underground. And the manifestos were anonymous. They're attributed to a group of scholars and friends in, I think, Tübingen, Germany. But it was only later, or quite a bit later, there's actually kind of a group that identified itself as Rosicrucian. Yeah, just a little bit more about these Rosicrucian manifestos. So the first one, Fama Fraternitatis, talks about the Rosicrucian Brotherhood as a group of wise men possessing knowledge of both science and mysticism. Describes the founder of the Brotherhood, Christian Rosenkreutz, and his travels through the world, learning secret knowledge and gaining spiritual insight. The second one, Confessio Fraternitatis, presents the Rosicrucian Brotherhood as Christian mystics who want to bring out a spiritual renewal of society. It emphasizes the importance of inner spiritual transformation rather than mere intellectual knowledge, and calls for the establishment of secret colleges where the true nature of things can be taught to those who are ready to receive it. Yeah, so I think that's just the thing that we see over and over again. And to the point about Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, it never really lost those secret colleges. I mean, that's what the monasteries. I mean, not that Indo-Tibetan Buddhism is perfect, but it always had that core of esoteric knowledge that Christianity forfeited and lost. And the last and most famous of the manifestos is the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, which presents this sort of allegory about a journey to a royal wedding with all these rituals and symbolisms, referencing alchemy, Hermetic philosophy, Christian symbolism, mythology, and so on. So then the Rosicrucian movement inspired later, not that much later, just a little bit later, alchemists who identified themselves with it, even though there really wasn't, this sort of underground movement as far as we know as such, including Robert Flood and Michael Meyer. And this really was the beginning of a kind of juncture, especially with the backlash, as Francis Yates notes. The 17th century philosophy, which was to replace the Renaissance philosophies, was Cartesian mechanism. Mechanism divested of magic became the philosophy which was to oust Renaissance animism and to replace the conjurer by the mechanical philosopher. And in fact, I think Descartes himself had a really deep interest in this Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And I think he was friends with the sort of disgraced prince and princess of Bohemia. The Cartesian philosophy began this whole movement in this other direction. Also from Yates. The most striking aspect of the Rosicrucian movement is its insistence on a coming enlightenment. The world nearing its end is to receive a new illumination. And this illumination shines inward as well as outward. It is an inward spiritual illumination, revealing to man new possibilities within himself, teaching him to understand his own dignity and worth and the part he is called upon to play in the divine scheme. So we're almost done here. Just a couple of few figures at the end. One is this fascinating character, Giordano Bruno, who was arrested by the Inquisition and burned at the stake in Rome in 1600. He was a Copernican. He believed that the sun was at the center of the solar system, but he was also a Neoplatonic Hermetic thinker, and it was more for his Hermetic philosophy than his Copernicanism that he was arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately burned. Among Bruno's feats, he created these memory palaces, which I believe Francis Yates also has a book about. The sort of way to remember a huge amount of material by building sort of an interior space like a castle, and then putting the different parts of the words that you need to know or the concepts in the different rooms of the castle. Just a quote from Bruno: "This entire globe, this star, not being subject to death and dissolution and annihilation, being impossible anywhere in nature, from time to time renews itself by changing and altering all its parts. There is no absolute up or down, as Aristotle taught, no absolute position in space, for the position of a body is relative to that of other bodies. Everywhere there is incessant relative change in position throughout the universe, and the observer is always at the center of things." You can see how close that is to very modern ideas. Here. And Bruno even had the idea that the universe is composed of an infinite number of worlds or other planets, potentially inhabited by other life forms, which was obviously a very, very radical notion at the time when the Earth and humanity was at the center of God's creation. So last, but probably not least, is Isaac Newton, who once again was this sort of fascinating kind of integration of science and alchemy. And spent a lot of his, while he developed calculus and the theory of gravity and made huge leaps in humanity's understanding of mathematics and so on. He also was a very dedicated alchemist who had his own, laboratory processes, studying, trying to attain the Philosopher's Stone, fascinated with the idea of transmutation from one element to the other, and also developed a number of theories, including corpuscular theory. I guess it is like a sort of prelude to atomism, the idea that all substances are composed of small, indivisible particles. We might talk a little bit more about Newton on Sundays. I'm still diving in to understand a little bit more of his alchemical interests. And even though Newton never found the Philosopher's Stone, he still felt the journey was worth the effort. He said, "They who search after the Philosopher's Stone are their own rules obliged to strict and religious life. That study is fruitful of experiments. This, of course, is William Blake's famous kind of mythologized portrait of Newton. All right, and that's where we get to. All right, guys, let's stop here for now, and I'll see you all Sunday. And thanks so much for joining me.